I'm Edward Lucas. I'm a senior editor at The Economist, and this week I reviewed a book about Pussy Riot, a bunch of Russians who are anonymous, known for their pastel balaclavas and their protests against the Putin regime. The book is by Masha Gessen, a well-known Russian-American journalist now living in New York, and she joins me from our studio there to talk about her book, Words Will Break Cement. Masha, tell us the story of how Pussy Riot became famous.
Well, Pussy Riot actually had a very brief run. They staged a series of guerrilla performances starting in the fall of 2011. They performed in places like shopping malls, fashion shows. As I said, these are guerrilla performances, so mostly they were very short, very sudden, and then they would put them together into clips that were sort of the resulting art product. They performed in front of a jail, they performed in Red Square, and then finally they performed in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Performed means that they actually lip-synced and played air guitar for 40 seconds, and then this was overlaid with the soundtrack of a song they had written called A Punk Prayer, in which they appealed to the Virgin Mary to chase Putin out.
This brought them into a lot of trouble. I mean, until the performance in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, they were just another small sort of opposition group that people had heard of, maybe if they followed Russian politics and Russian culture very closely. But they certainly weren't a mainstream political issue, but they became one when they were prosecuted.
Right, absolutely. It drew incredible outsized reaction. A criminal case was started against them. They went into hiding. The police chased them for 2 weeks, finally found three of the 5 women who had been in the cathedral, and they were arrested. They were arrested symbolically enough on the day that Putin was reelected for his 3rd term as president. And they were tried in August of 2012 in Moscow in what can only be described as a witch trial, and sentenced to 2 years in prison for felony hooliganism.
And it's a big part of your book is describing the trial. You go into the cultural background, of course, from which they emerged, but certainly for me, the descriptions of the sort of farcical nature of the trial and also the parallels you draw with trials of the Soviet dissidents in the Soviet era was very powerful and very, very moving.
It's a farce, but it's a farce that put these women in prison for 2 years. And they were accused of felony hooliganism. Felony hooliganism is defined as a crude disturbance of the social order, and it has to be, it's a hate crime. So it has to be motivated by enmity or hatred for a particular social group. So they were accused of committing a crime motivated by hatred for Russian Orthodox believers.
So the entire anti-Putin nature of the protest was really obscured from the point of view of the Russian public. They just saw this as an act of kind of gratuitous blasphemy. You also go into some detail in the book about the prison conditions for the 2 of them who ended up behind bars, and that's also highlighted something which perhaps also with the release of Mikhail Khodorkovsky has come very much into focus, of the abominable conditions in the Russian penal system.
Right, and in fact, since I finished the book, Nadia and Maria, the 2 women who ended up serving time, were released from prison. They were amnestied, as it were, by Putin, who generously knocked 2 months off their sentences to varnish his image before the Olympics. And they have emerged very, very different than they went in, predictably enough. And they are launching a movement for prisoners' rights in Russia. So they have been very vocal about prison conditions. They have actually emerged with the most detailed and frank description of prison conditions in Russia that anyone has ever come with, certainly since the times of Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov, who described the conditions in the Gulag. And what we're seeing is that the conditions in contemporary Russian prisons are quite similar to those conditions that were described during Stalin's time.
Your book, in part, is a chronicle of political opposition and repression, but it's also a kind of miniature cultural history of Russia as well, looking at the roots of, the rather thin roots of modern feminism in Russia and the way in which, both from an intellectual and from a day-to-day point of view, the kind of feminist discourse which we take for granted in some Western countries just isn't there in Russia. Just outline how Pussy Riot fits into the Russian sort of modern cultural history.
Right, yeah. Well, writing the cultural history of feminism in Russia was the easiest thing I've ever done because it takes up about a page and a half. Basically, it's a paradoxical history, but a very, very abrupt one. Right after the revolution, feminism and sort of radical feminism was among several schools of thought that had a hold on a group of Russians for a short period of time. And then the Soviet Union went into a prolonged period of sort of traditionalist stagnation, which is something that Putin is very successfully recreating right now. And feminism was portrayed, in fact, its official definition in the Soviet Encyclopedia was a bourgeois school of thought. And it sort of never regained any credibility despite some people's best efforts in the 1990s. So most Russians see it as silly and superfluous. They have a stereotype of feminists as the women who beat men up for daring to open doors for them. And this is something that actually placed Pussy Riot, and especially Nadia, whose brainchild Pussy Riot was, sort of apart from Russian culture.
I think your book follows on, your Pussy Riot book follows on from your scalding biography of Vladimir Putin called Man Without a Face, which is, I think, the most critical book written about Putin to date, against stiff competition, I might add, but I still think it's out there in front. Gold medalist in terms of the Olympics, if you like, of the anti-Putin Olympics. But as we come up to the real Olympics in Sochi, the Winter Olympics, just to finish with, what's your feeling about the Putin establishment, or Putin regime, as the critics would say? Do you think it's actually hollowing out, or has it gained a new lease of life with the seeming collapse of the opposition and the inattention of the West?
What I think is happening is a very prolonged agony, but very prolonged are the key words here, and agony is sort of a secondary concept. I think it's the last stage of the Putin regime. But I think he has chosen the most effective tactic for confronting mass protest. I mean, a dictator faced by mass protest can either try to co-opt the protesters, institute soft reforms, and that sounds and looks like a saner strategy. But a more effective strategy is a crackdown. Keeps the dictator stable for longer. And that's what Putin is doing. And one of the reasons I was interested in Pussy Riot was because it became clear to me after a few months that their arrest was the beginning of the crackdown. It's sort of it begins that chronology, the chronology of the latest era in Russian politics, which unfortunately I think can last quite a long time.
That's a depressing note to end on, but probably an accurate one. Masha Gessen, thanks so much for joining us from our studio in New York.
Thank you very much, Edward.
The Economist.